Many commentators and essays have broached the subject of game difficulty, the usual point of contention being, what is the right way to play a game? The authentic way. Just taking the difficulty screen itself, the usual settings of easy, medium, and hard, from the jump, players are asked to make decisions with options that are ultimately unhelpful. I'm sure many have stared at the screen wondering if they should know what that means. Almost like something is missing. I know for me, I end up stuck thinking, if I pick anything under medium, I'm pleb, and that usually ends with me choosing hard because I think in some deep down way I hate myself. What can I say? But ultimately, games are incredibly diverse. They can't be identified or epitomized based on these vague levels of difficulty. A shooter like Battlefield 1 is simply a different beast than a puzzle game like Tetris Effect. They require totally different operating procedures. And in thinking about games that require little in terms of input skill, like Civilization with its turn-based gameplay, where players are judged more on their ability to methodically weigh each decision, the actual input requirements are the same as a Facebook page. Just a bunch of clicking. That same Civ player, given a game like CSGO, may be able to think complexly about the game world and craft strategies of the best way to navigate the world, but without the proper hand-eye coordination and input skill, they'll be slaughtered by a 10-year-old who doesn't even know what the word tactical means. Returning to the situation of a player seeing that difficulty screen for any of these games, one should ask how they would have any idea what they would actually enjoy. Making something difficult, importantly, is easy, but making it engaging as well, difficult. Some may point to games with small descriptions laying out what factors are changed, like in Dishonored, where the enemies are more alert and stronger at higher difficulties. Or games that come out and say, this is the premier way to play this game. The developers are saying, this is our stamp of approval. But as I go over in more detail later in this video, this is not so clear-cut. For those games that don't even have such a vague description, players are forced to hope for the best with which word they think best fits them. Are they the players that are hardcore, they can take the greatest difficulty, or are they the little babies with the easy mode? Oh, please, please, let me have it. Let me play the game, daddy. Wolfenstein, for as much as his tradition, effectively says this when you go to easy mode. You have a little baby boy. Little baby boy. Thinking about the droning dialogue around game difficulties, they're playing on a harder difficulty is the intended plague christened by the video game gods, or if game's difficulty should be accommodated to all players, no matter their skill level, it's ultimately an exercise in talking past one another. They are in many ways showing more about themselves than they are about difficulty in general. What they think is the right way to play a game, or the intended way, says a lot about you. One of the arguments that has stuck with me is what should be expected from people who review or write about games, whether they be hobbyists with a small blog, to the big publishers like IGN or Kotaku or Eurogamer. To use a specific one, I'm using the argument from Sacred Symbols' Colin Moriarty and his view on games journalism in relation to difficulty.
You know, I'm not trying to pick on anyone per se, but I'm gonna make fun of you when you're like, I always play games on easy difficulty for review, and I'm never gonna not play games on easy. It's like, what? Like, do you like,
right.
I'm sorry, but do you like games? It's not a matter of trying to take the piss out of you for not having the skill or the patience, but you're not playing the game as intended when you're playing it on easy. I'm sorry. And that is there for accessibility purposes. That is there for younger or less experienced gamers, or it's there if you just want to see the story, but that's not your job to do it. You are the critic. So you play it the way it is intended to be played. Am I right or wrong?
Now, this claim of a reviewer having the journalistic obligation to having played the game at a higher difficulty to have really experienced the game and to then be able to have a more total perspective on the game, this is an interesting perspective, but I think showcases some strange assumptions about what difficulty means for the experience of playing a game. Now, I would agree that playing a game on the easiest difficulty would only give the game reviewer only a partial view of the experience. But in the same way, a hard difficulty would give you just another partial view. Just in the same way that Colin remarks the game reviewers are being dishonest about saying they played the entirety of the game when they've only played on the easy version, the same can be true about someone who played it on just a higher difficulty. It may seem like you have more of the game, but you just have a different part of the game. Take a level of Doom 2016. On the easier difficulties, the number of enemies is lessened and their AI is less aggressive, with the opposite being true on a higher difficulty. How that feels in each of these environments to one player versus another is based on many variables of strategy, skill, and how they choose to traverse an environment. Prescribing a difficulty to any player, as this should be the intended or required difficulty out of several options, will most likely not result in the optimal experience for that individual. There's an assumption that's been made that something that is more difficult like more stuff in this instance, which a lot of games, that's the marker of something being more difficult. There are more enemies, there's more damage being dealt, there's, I mean, I guess for survival horror, there's less ammo, but is that fun? Like, does that make the game fun for people? Or is it just a particular amount of these things? So someone could go in and they think that the highest difficulty was the way they were supposed to be played, and they didn't enjoy it. But say they went down that just a notch to medium, the game is more fluid, it feels more fun, you're not stopping every 5 seconds when you die. And this is just person to person. Again, this is just subjective. It's not a matter of one being more right, I should make it clear. Just that only playing in these narrow ways simply can't give the perspective to make a judgment that other modes are better or worse. This is not to say that it's all immaterial and not worth describing. It is an important barometer, but its importance is only as helpful as its context. It should be one of many factors that should be contextualized. Game reviewers and those who describe games would do well to describe the context of their game experience. And some of these already exist, like identifying what system they played on or how many hours they played, but additives like the number of hours one played, and of course, disclosing the difficulty they played would allow players, readers, and watchers to better understand what info they are getting from those who tell them about the games they love. And ultimately, the appreciation that games can be played in a variety of ways, and there's not just one way to experience this game. Now, ultimately, I'm sympathetic to both sides of this argument, assuming they are even that clearly and cleanly defined. Now turning to the other side, where the hardest difficulty is argued as the more authentic experience. Though I'm sure there are some that are coming from a place of elitism, I believe that most are basing their opinion on some form of tradition, or what I will describe as achievement-focused gaming. In terms of tradition, most early video games were made by developers that were highly trained scientists that programmed their games as such. With this in mind, one of the first games, Space War, which was notoriously complicated in regards to its physics and input requirements, and obviously didn't make it very commercial. Turning to the games in the arcade, games were made harsh and unkind to the player, just to get as many quarters out of players as possible. As games migrated to consoles and PCs, most kept this structure unthinkingly with the same high score focus and a set number of lives. Think of your Marios, think of your Contras, think of effectively most games on the NES. This also stemmed from a need to, in general, extend play. Players couldn't necessarily return a game if it took them 6 months to beat versus a week to beat, or simply because developers are not necessarily the best at discerning what is an appropriate difficulty when they've spent the whole development cycle playing it. To take a specific example, Psychonauts was notoriously difficult at the end because playtesters in the game had advocated for a raise in difficulty that was probably more a reflection of their own skill level rather than what audiences would have enjoyed. Though this should be tempered by the fact that early on in the games industry, companies like Atari and Nintendo had departments specifically made to test the game by audience they were trying to sell to, and in some cases would profit off of the difficulty of games. Nintendo, for instance, sold magazines with secrets and information on how to beat their notoriously hard games.
During my whole development years, going through middle school and everything, it was just all, Mega Mans, Marios, Metroids, those older, very, very difficult games. All of these games, like every one of these games on this wall, F-Zero was hard, Mega Man was very, very difficult, Spy Hunter was stupidly difficult.
And there was even a whole hotline for players to call in and get assistance, which was of course paid for out of the pockets of parents and adult gamers alike.
If you're one of America's 65 million Mario-loving maniacs, you know the lingo. If not, you may be asking yourself, what are they talking about? They're talking strategy. They're talking warp zones. They're talking Nintendo, a video game phenomenon that's still going strong 6 years later. Today, 200 game counselors based in Redmond, Washington, field questions from players all over the United States, Europe, and Canada.
And we're taking 140,000 calls a week, which is 20,000 a day, if that means anything. It's incredible.
They made serious bank off games being difficult. More recently, but still in the vein of tradition, there is this achievements issue.
It's here, and it's on.
With the advent of achievements or rewards for completing the game in particular ways on Xbox 360, Games were given very explicit codified information on how a game should be played. Though importantly, the ubiquity of achievements, trophies, Steam Awards is in many cases a mandate for a release, especially on consoles. And though games in the past had completion scores for completing their games, like a Banjo-Kazooie or a Kingdom Hearts 2, this was game by game, but with achievements and trophies, there was a comparative and in many cases uniform way of how games are now seen as more completed by players. Also, achievements drive how players approach a game. If an achievement calls for players to get 50 headshots in a particular level, they now have this new task, a roadmap. But does that make that level better? Probably not. Many developers have lamented in retrospect that it may have hurt their games. If players are laboriously going through tedious tasks to get all of these achievements, the player's opinion of the game will likely get worse, not better. Compulsion, not enjoyment for its own sake, is what drives achievements and trophy hunters. And this was a real fascination. I mean, especially for me when I was growing up. I mean, the biggest channels we watched, I remember all my friends obsessing over Achievement Hunter, and they're still fucking around. I mean, in a different way. They don't necessarily do the same kind of shit, but it's funny that like we would spend all this time and I was genuinely concerned with getting these virtual rewards. It was a real thing, and it continues to be. In trying to give more players more ways to play your game, it actually pushes them to play in ways that are more likely counterintuitive to their own enjoyment and exploration of a game. I know for me, I have to turn my trophies and achievements or whatever I'm using off now. I turn the notifications off. I don't want to see them because sometimes I like the idea that I'm kind of discovering something. And you don't really get that when you get an achievement that says, oh, you've unlocked the secret. It's not really mine anymore. Someone getting all the achievements in a game does not mean they better appreciate the story or an experience, or necessarily take more time to soak in the atmosphere of the world. Take an achievement from a game like BioShock. One of its achievements, named Historian, asks the player to find all of the audio diaries. There's a few problems with this goal. Firstly, players understand that these little pieces of the world are inherently finite. Players searching for them for the achievement sees them purely as a collectible, a thing to do for points. Instead of these being pieces of world building that allow the player to believe in the environment around them, that it is a living, breathing world. Secondly, there's the issue that someone collecting them versus really listening and taking them in is a chasm between the two. An achievement can't exemplify that. So in thinking about the reviewer leaving their achievement score or a list of completion for the readers, many would assume if they had completed the achievements list or platinumed a game that they would understand it better than the person who took the time to dig into the details of the world, but never tried to get the most headshots or blow up X number of red barrels. I want to know what you got out of the game. What did you personally feel when you completed a game? Not, oh yeah, I fucking did this level in this hardest way. I don't care. I just don't. Now to deal with this issue of achievements and trophies related to difficulty. Anyone who's beaten the game on the hardest difficulty first will know that strange enjoyment one gets as the credits roll and each difficulty achievement starts rolling in. Easy, medium, hard, very hard, all flashing on the screen for a moment with the chime and notification hitting all of those dopamine centers. For many, that all but squares away the need to go back and experience another difficulty, to see if they would have enjoyed the game at medium or easy. And in the eyes of the achievement list, that player had already completed all the difficulties by virtue of beating the hardest one. And just looking at how they're valued, the higher the difficulty, the more points you get. So the game is pretty much telling you, or by this achievement list, the harder difficulty you do means you've experienced more, you've done more. So returning to the gamer that believes the hardest difficulty is the authentic way to play, from the achievements list, they're not wrong. Now let's turn for a moment to this idea more centrally of intended play in terms of difficulty. A game like Tetris has a pretty restrictive play space, and in general most people will have pretty similar experiences. Though, looking at a game like BioShock Infinite, the game is magnitudes more complicated and packs infinitely more technology and people power behind it. And with that complexity comes for more opportunity for the whole to be messed with, allowing players to break what we have assumed was intended play, or what designers assumed would be intended play.
This is the part when you meet her, when you get in touch with her, where she's really completely emergent, and she's basically pulling upon a ton of content we've created, but he's being driven by the player's cues, not by her own cues. This is the beach where all the blood was spilled on the Irrational team. This is where we kept working on her and working on her and working on her until it's painful just to watch for me, but it was, once we had her working here, we knew we can get her working in the rest of the games.
So imagine our feeling when you see a player who just picks up the controller and just runs right to the door, which happens. But the game works that way, and and we always feel at Irrational that the power of seeing something that you feel you found on your own versus something that's forced upon you is what makes the games we do a little different, because you're a participant. Nobody's forcing the narrative on you. It's up to you to seek it out and find it. And some people rush to the beach, and some people spend an hour there, and you just have to be willing to let that go to be successful with this model.
If a player like Ken Levine described simply jumps around the character and fucks with them, there is no way to meaningfully account for all human interaction. I was listening to the podcast Play, Watch, Listen, and Austin Wintory, a video game composer with works including Journey, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and The Pathless, was discussing how during the development of Flow, his first video game project, that there was this debate around the sound options in the game. His co-developers were pushing for the feature of controlling the volume of the music, which to Wintory seemed ridiculous. If a player could turn off the music, they would be losing something fundamental about the game experience, especially for a game like Flow that was attempting to, well, induce the state of flow in the player by using compositions that were tied to the interactions on screen to elicit this state. Ultimately, he realized that if it was up to the player, that it was their choice to listen to this work or not listen, just as it was their choice to move this way or that way. He, in that moment, gave himself to the interactive nature of games. In general, though we don't necessarily think about things like music, brightness, subtitles, and even variables like skipping a cutscene in the same way as we do about difficulty, they all lead to incredibly different experiences. And I would say probably more so. Without Jose Gonzalez's Far Away taking over the soundscape when John Marston enters Mexico for the first time, can the player appreciate the emotion of that scene in the same way? Does a game like Resident Evil 7 work if the player turns the brightness up as high as it goes? Does skipping every bit of dialogue in Psychonauts lose the point? Well, honestly, it's kind of a hard thing to answer, even if it sounds obvious. Like a lot of these settings, it's on a spectrum, and deeply individual. Every little variable that players can change affects how a game can be interpreted, and there's most likely a setting configuration that would better suit their experience and turn a hated game into one of their favorites. This is on a continuum, of course. If one has been on Game Analysis YouTube for long, you've probably heard of how Naughty Dog subliminally ushers their players where they want them to go, through color and light. Usually this is denoted by surfaces such as ledges for a Nathan Drake monkeying about, or for a chase sequence where the next place to run is bathed in yellow. The usual takeaway is that a developer is meant to always act in line with that of a film director, quietly ushering the player to the next hotspot of interaction. Though I don't necessarily disagree with the conclusions of this type of analysis, I think it's important to include players in these types of discussions. These suggestions by the developers are just that, suggestions. And in the end, developers like shown by Wintory and Levine, by the nature of the medium, have to give themselves to the players because those suggestions only function in the context that they can and will fail. That to me is what intended play is, should be understood as. What the player does, is able to do, is intended, is the right way to play the game. Pulling this back to difficulty then, we can argue about what's the proper difficulty one should play. But to me, if we really wanted people to experience games in one specific way, then we should just have them watch a film, or listen to a song, or read a book.